In the spring of 1829, a tenant farmer working the fields near the Delaware-Maryland border made a discovery that would expose one of America's most chilling criminal enterprises. His plow horse suddenly sank into the earth, revealing a wooden chest buried beneath the soil. Inside lay the skeletal remains of what appeared to be a man, his bones yellowed with age and his skull showing clear signs of violence. This was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, authorities would uncover the bodies of at least 7 people on this property, including 3 children, all victims of a woman whose name had already become a whispered terror throughout the Delmarva Peninsula, Martha "Patty" Cannon. For nearly 2 decades, Cannon had operated what historians now call the reverse Underground Railroad, a network that kidnapped free African Americans and escaped slaves to sell them back into bondage in the Deep South. But this wasn't just about human trafficking. Cannon was also a serial killer who murdered rival slave traders, witnesses, and even children when they posed a threat to her operations. Court records from Sussex County, Delaware, show she was indicted for 4 murders, though witnesses claimed the true number exceeded 20. Before we continue with the story of Patty Cannon and her reign of terror along the Mason-Dixon line, I want to hear from you. What state or city are you listening from? The reach of Cannon's criminal network extended far beyond her Delaware stronghold, touching communities from Philadelphia to the Mississippi Delta. Leave a comment and let me know where you're hearing this story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These dark chapters of American history deserve to be remembered. The discovery of those buried remains would ultimately unravel a criminal conspiracy that had operated with virtual impunity for over a decade, protected by jurisdictional confusion, racial prejudice, and the simple fact that most of its victims were people whose disappearances went largely unnoticed by white society. The area where Patty Cannon built her empire of terror was uniquely suited for criminal activity. In the early 1800s, the region now known as Reliance sat at the intersection of 3 jurisdictions, Sussex County in Delaware and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. This strategic location allowed criminals to literally step across county and state lines to escape pursuing lawmen. The spot was so remote that locals called it Johnson's Crossroads, named for the tavern that would become the headquarters of the most notorious kidnapping ring in American history. The landscape itself seemed designed for concealment. Dense forests of pine and oak stretched for miles, broken only by marshy lowlands and small clearings where isolated farmsteads dotted the countryside. The Nanticoke River wound through the region, providing waterways that could transport captives silently under cover of darkness. Roads were little more than cart paths, and the nearest substantial towns were days away by horseback. For someone seeking to operate outside the law, it was an ideal location. Martha Cannon, called Patty by those who knew her, had arrived in this borderland sometime around 1790. Court records suggest she was born around 1760, possibly under the name Lucretia Patricia Hanley, though she kept her origins deliberately vague. Some accounts place her birth in Canada, with immigration to Delaware at age 16. What is documented is her marriage to Jesse Cannon, a local farmer who owned property near the state line. Together they had at least 1 daughter and lived what appeared to be an unremarkable rural life. Jesse Cannon was described by neighbors as a quiet man who kept to himself, working his small farm and raising tobacco and corn like dozens of other settlers in the region. The Cannon homestead sat on a modest plot of land that straddled the Delaware-Maryland border, a detail that would prove crucial to Patty's later criminal activities. The house itself was a simple 2-story structure, built in the common style of the period with thick wooden walls and small windows. What neighbors didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary home would soon house secret rooms and hidden spaces designed to conceal kidnapped human beings. But beneath this veneer of normalcy lay something far darker. The early 1800s marked a crucial period in American slavery, when Congress banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa in 1808. The demand for human labor in the expanding cotton fields of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia created a lucrative domestic market. A healthy adult slave who might have cost $300 before the ban now sold for over $1,000 in the Deep South. This price surge created powerful incentives for criminals willing to traffic in human misery. The economic transformation of the South following the invention of the cotton gin had created an insatiable demand for enslaved labor. Cotton production was expanding rapidly across the Gulf Coast states, and planters were willing to pay premium prices for workers. The legal ban on importing slaves from Africa meant that the only source of new enslaved people was the domestic population, either through natural increase or through the capture and re-enslavement of free African Americans. The Delmarva Peninsula was particularly vulnerable to these predators. Following the Revolutionary War, many enslaved people had been freed by their owners, either through gradual emancipation laws or individual acts of manumission. Maryland and Delaware had substantial populations of free African Americans who worked as laborers, artisans, and small farmers. These communities, while legally free, lived in constant fear. They had no powerful protectors, limited legal recourse, and their disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated by white authorities who viewed them as less than fully human. The legal status of free African Americans in the early 1800s was precarious at best. While they were not enslaved, they possessed few of the rights enjoyed by white citizens. They could not vote, serve on juries, or testify against white defendants in most courts. Their freedom could be challenged at any time, and they were required to carry papers proving their status. For criminals like Patty Cannon, these legal vulnerabilities created opportunities for exploitation. Into this environment stepped Patty Cannon, a woman who would prove that evil recognizes no gender boundaries. Contemporary accounts describe her as a large, physically imposing woman with unusual strength for her gender. She stood nearly 6 feet tall in an era when most women barely reached 5 feet, and she possessed what neighbors described as an intimidating presence. Her voice was reportedly deep and commanding, and she had a reputation for violent outbursts when crossed. Her husband Jesse died under mysterious circumstances around 1826. Some later claimed she poisoned him, leaving her a widow with complete control over the family property. By this time, she had already begun forming the criminal connections that would make her name synonymous with terror. Local law enforcement was virtually non-existent in the rural border region, and what little authority existed was often corrupt or simply overwhelmed by the scale of criminal activity. The social dynamics of the region also favored criminal enterprises. The white population was sparse and often transient, consisting largely of small farmers, laborers, and people seeking to escape their pasts in more settled areas. There was little sense of community cohesion, and neighbors often minded their own business regardless of what they might suspect about their neighbors' activities. This isolation and indifference would prove crucial to Cannon's ability to operate undetected for so many years. The transformation of Patty Cannon from frontier widow to criminal mastermind began with her daughter's marriages. In a pattern that would define the next 2 decades, both of the young woman's husbands were slave kidnappers. Her first husband, Henry Brereton, was a blacksmith who supplemented his income by capturing free African Americans for sale in the South. In 1811, Brereton was arrested and imprisoned in Georgetown, Delaware for kidnapping, but he managed to escape from jail that same year. Brereton's criminal activities had been well known in the local community long before his arrest. As a blacksmith, he had legitimate reasons to travel throughout the region, visiting farms and settlements to shoe horses and repair tools. This mobility provided perfect cover for his illegal activities. He would identify potential victims during his legitimate business calls, noting which families had teenage children or young adults who might bring high prices in southern slave markets. The methods employed by early kidnappers like Brereton were often crude but effective. They relied on deception, overwhelming force, and the isolated nature of rural life to capture their victims. A common technique involved approaching free African American families with offers of employment in distant locations. Parents desperate for economic opportunities for their children would sometimes allow them to travel with these supposed employers, only to discover too late that they had signed their children's death warrants. It was after his escape that the first documented murder connected to the Cannon family occurred. Brereton, working with Paddy Cannon and another criminal named Joseph Griffith, ambushed a slave trader known only as Rigel at Cannon's tavern. The plan was simple but brutal. Get the victim drunk, rob him of his money and slaves, then eliminate the witness. Court records show that Rigel was shot and killed during the robbery. Brereton and Griffith were eventually captured and hanged on April 13, 1813, but Paddy Cannon escaped prosecution. The Rigel murder marked a significant escalation in the criminal activities centered around the Cannon property. Prior to this incident, the family had been involved primarily in facilitating kidnappings and providing safe haven for criminals passing through the region. The willingness to commit murder for profit demonstrated a level of ruthlessness that would characterize all of Cannon's future activities. Contemporary newspaper accounts of the Rigel case provide disturbing details about the crime. The victim had been traveling through the region with a substantial amount of money. Estimates suggest between $3,000 and $5,000, intended for purchasing enslaved people in local markets. He had stopped at what he believed was a legitimate tavern for food and lodging, unaware that he had walked into a trap. The conspirators plied him with alcohol throughout the evening, waiting for the right moment to strike. When Rigel finally retired to his room, Brereton and Griffith followed him. Neighbors later reported hearing shouting and the sound of a struggle, followed by a gunshot. By morning, Rigel was dead, his money was gone, and his wagon and horses had disappeared. The body was hastily buried on the property, beginning what would become a regular practice of using the isolated location as a dumping ground for murder victims. The execution of her daughter's first husband did nothing to deter Cannon from her chosen path. Instead, it seemed to refine her methods and strengthen her resolve to build a more sophisticated criminal organization. The lesson she drew from Brereton's capture was not that crime didn't pay, but rather that criminals needed better organization and more careful planning to avoid detection. When her daughter remarried, this time to Joseph Johnson, Cannon gained a partner who would prove even more valuable to her criminal enterprise. Johnson wasn't just another kidnapper. He was a businessman who understood the logistics of human trafficking on a regional scale. He had connections throughout the South, experience in transportation and logistics, and most importantly, the capital necessary to expand their operations beyond simple opportunistic crimes. Johnson brought to the partnership a tavern located precisely on the Delaware-Maryland state line. This establishment, which became known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, was positioned so strategically that different rooms literally sat in different states. This geographic advantage allowed them to move kidnapped victims between jurisdictions to confuse pursuing authorities. When Delaware lawmen arrived with warrants, suspects could simply step into the Maryland portions of the building and claim immunity from Delaware jurisdiction. The tavern served multiple purposes in the expanding criminal enterprise. It was a legitimate business that provided cover for their activities, generating income and explaining the constant flow of travelers and wagons through the property. It functioned as a holding facility for captives awaiting transport south, with specially constructed hidden rooms and cellars designed to conceal human cargo. And it served as a meeting place for the network of criminals who worked for them, a neutral ground where plans could be made and profits divided. The physical layout of the tavern reflected its multiple functions. The main floor appeared completely normal, with a common room for travelers, a bar area, and rooms for legitimate guests. But beneath the building lay a series of cellars and tunnels that had been specially constructed for hiding kidnapped people. These underground spaces were accessible through concealed entrances and were designed to muffle sound and prevent escape. Iron rings set into stone walls provided anchor points for chains, while small ventilation shafts ensured that captives wouldn't suffocate during long periods of confinement. The gang that assembled around Cannon and Johnson was remarkably diverse for its time. It included white criminals like Henry Carr, mixed-race decoys such as John Purnell, who used multiple aliases, and even enslaved people forced to participate in capturing others. This multiracial composition was strategic. African-American gang members could approach potential victims without immediately raising suspicions, while white members handled negotiations with buyers in the Deep South. John Purnell, described in court records as a yellow man or mulatto, was particularly valuable to the organization. His mixed racial heritage allowed him to move between white and African-American communities with relative ease. He maintained multiple identities and could present himself as either a free person of color seeking work or a light-skinned white man conducting business, depending on the situation. This chameleon-like ability made him an ideal scout for identifying potential victims and establishing initial contact. As the 1820s progressed, the scope of the Cannon-Johnson operation expanded dramatically. Their network stretched from Pennsylvania to Louisiana, with documented connections to buyers in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, a Quaker deeply committed to protecting free African Americans, began tracking the disappearances of citizens from his city and tracing them back to the Delmarva Peninsula. Watson's investigations revealed the horrifying scale of the operation. In 1825 alone, he documented dozens of kidnappings connected to the Cannon Gang. The victims weren't just random targets, they were often specifically chosen for their vulnerability. Young adults brought the highest prices in southern markets, but children were also valuable as they could be trained for specific tasks and would provide decades of labor. The systematic nature of these kidnappings demonstrated a level of organization that went far beyond opportunistic crime. The gang maintained detailed intelligence about potential targets, tracking families and individuals who might be vulnerable to capture. They knew which young people had recently lost their jobs, which families were struggling financially, and which individuals might be tempted by offers of employment in distant locations. One of the most detailed accounts comes from Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman who was kidnapped in 1825. Her testimony, preserved in court records, describes being held first in Cannon's house, then moved to Johnson's Tavern, where she was kept in chains for 5 months. Smith recalled the constant fear, the inadequate food, and the knowledge that she was scheduled to be transported south with a large group of other kidnapped people. Only her eventual rescue by Watson's network saved her from a lifetime of bondage. Smith's account provides crucial details about the conditions endured by victims of the Cannon Gang. She described being seized while walking alone on a road near Philadelphia, overpowered by multiple attackers, and transported by wagon to the Delaware-Maryland border. The journey took several days, during which she was kept blindfolded and chained to prevent escape attempts. Upon arrival at the Cannon property, she was placed in a hidden room beneath the main house, where she discovered she was not alone. The underground holding areas, according to Smith's testimony, contained dozens of other kidnapped people at various times. Men, women, and children were kept in separate areas, all chained to prevent escape. The conditions were deliberately harsh. Inadequate food, no sanitation facilities, and constant darkness except when guards brought candles during feeding times. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical conditions, as captives knew they were destined for sale into lifelong bondage. Smith also provided details about the gang's methods for processing their human cargo. Victims were systematically stripped of any documentation proving their free status, and any personal belongings that might help identify them were destroyed. They were given new names and false backgrounds that would support their sale as legitimate slaves. Those who resisted or attempted to maintain their true identities were beaten until they complied. The gang's operations were an open secret in the local community. Neighbors knew that people disappeared near the Cannon property, that wagons arrived at odd hours, and that Johnson's Tavern hosted suspicious meetings. But the victims were African Americans in a society where their word carried little weight against that of white criminals. Local law enforcement, when it existed at all, showed little interest in investigating crimes against people they viewed as inherently suspicious. The complicity of the local white community in the gang's activities went beyond mere indifference. Some neighbors actively supported the criminal enterprise, either through direct participation or by providing information about potential victims. Local merchants supplied the gang with provisions, asking no questions about the source of their payment. Even some law enforcement officials were suspected of taking bribes to look the other way when suspicious activities were reported. This indifference changed only when white victims entered the equation. The gang didn't just kidnap free African Americans. They also robbed and murdered slave traders who came through their territory, carrying large amounts of cash. These victims were white men engaged in the legal slave trade, and their disappearances attracted the attention that African American victims never received. The first documented case occurred around 1820 when a slave trader from Georgia named Bell or Miller vanished while traveling through the area. This man had been carrying a substantial sum of money. Some accounts suggest $35,000, intended for purchasing enslaved people. He was last seen at Cannon's establishment, and his horse was later found in her possession. When questioned, Cannon claimed the man had sailed south with a cargo of enslaved people, but investigators found this story implausible. The Georgia trader's disappearance marked the beginning of a pattern that would eventually lead to the gang's downfall. Unlike African American victims, whose disappearances generated little official interest, missing white slave traders had business partners and financial backers who demanded investigations. These men carried substantial amounts of money and had planned itineraries that made their disappearances difficult to explain away. Cannon's method for dealing with these victims was typically brutal. The traders would be invited to the tavern under the pretense of conducting legitimate business. Once there, they would be plied with alcohol and encouraged to discuss their financial resources and travel plans. When the opportunity arose, they would be murdered and robbed, their bodies buried on the property, and their money and any enslaved people they were traveling with would be incorporated into the gang's operations. The profits from these murders were substantial. A single slave trader might carry enough money to fund the gang's operations for months. The enslaved people they were transporting could be sold through the gang's southern networks, generating additional income. Most importantly, eliminating these competitors helped the gang maintain their monopoly on criminal activities in the region. By the mid-1820s, pressure was mounting on the Cannon-Johnson gang from multiple directions. Mayor Watson of Philadelphia had begun offering substantial rewards for information leading to arrests, and Governor John Andrew Schulze of Pennsylvania was coordinating with officials in southern states to track kidnapped citizens. Their investigations were revealing not just individual crimes, but a systematic network that had been operating for over a decade. The reward offered by Watson, $500 for information leading to arrests, represented a substantial sum for the period, equivalent to several months' wages for most working people. This financial incentive began to loosen tongues in communities that had previously remained silent about the gang's activities. Former associates, dissatisfied gang members, and even some victims who had managed to escape began providing information to authorities. The gang's response to this pressure was characteristically violent. Rather than scaling back their operations, they began eliminating potential witnesses more aggressively. This decision would ultimately prove to be their downfall, as it expanded their list of victims to include people whose disappearances could not be ignored. The escalation in violence during this period reflected Patty Cannon's increasingly paranoid mindset. She had built a criminal empire that generated enormous profits. Estimates suggest the gang's annual income exceeded $50,000, a fortune by early 19th century standards. But this success had made her a target for law enforcement attention, and she became convinced that former associates posed an existential threat to her operations. The most crucial figure in the gang's eventual exposure was a mixed-race boy named Cyrus James. Cannon had purchased James as a slave when he was only 7 years old and had raised him in her household. As he grew older, James was forced to participate in the gang's activities, serving as a decoy to lure other African Americans into traps. His intimate knowledge of the gang's operations, combined with his growing revulsion at the violence he witnessed, made him both an invaluable asset and a potential liability. James's position in the Cannon household was unique and tragically complex. As an enslaved child, he had no choice but to participate in whatever activities his owner demanded. But as he matured, he began to understand the full horror of what he was being forced to do. He was helping to destroy the lives of people who looked like him, people who shared his heritage and his vulnerability. This knowledge created an internal conflict that would eventually lead him to cooperate with authorities, despite the personal risks involved. The psychological manipulation employed by Cannon to control James was sophisticated and cruel. She alternated between treating him as a favored member of the household and threatening him with violence or sale to brutal masters in the Deep South. She convinced him that his survival depended entirely on her protection and that any betrayal would result in his immediate death. This combination of dependency and terror kept James loyal for years, even as he witnessed increasingly horrific crimes. James later testified that he witnessed Cannon murder multiple children on her property. In one particularly horrific account, he described seeing Cannon take a wounded African-American child, not yet dead, from the house in her apron, only for the child to never return. James knew where the bodies were buried because he had been forced to help dispose of them. The murders James witnessed were not random acts of violence, but calculated decisions based on Cannon's assessment of risk and profit. Children who became sick or injured were killed rather than treated, as medical care would have been expensive and would have attracted unwanted attention. Young people who proved difficult to control or who maintained their insistence on their free status were eliminated as potential sources of trouble. Even infants born to kidnapped women were sometimes killed if Cannon determined they would be more trouble than they were worth. The gang's undoing began with their treatment of rival slave traders. Competition in the illegal human trafficking trade was fierce, and Cannon's gang had developed a reputation for murdering competitors to steal their money and their human cargo. This practice accelerated as legitimate law enforcement pressure increased. Dead slave traders couldn't testify about their experiences with the gang. The decision to escalate their violence against white victims reflected both Cannon's growing desperation and her fundamental miscalculation about the consequences of such actions. She had operated for so long with impunity that she believed herself untouchable. The murder of African Americans had generated no serious law enforcement response, so she assumed that the same would be true for white victims. This assumption would prove fatal to her criminal enterprise. In early 1829, the bodies began to surface. A tenant farmer working land owned by Cannon was plowing a low-lying area that had recently been cleared of brush when his horse stumbled into what proved to be a grave. Inside a wooden chest, he discovered human bones that authorities determined belonged to the missing Georgia slave trader from nearly a decade earlier. This discovery triggered a systematic search of the property that would uncover multiple burial sites. The farmer who made the initial discovery was working land that Cannon had rented out for additional income. The area had previously been unused because it was prone to flooding, but recent dry weather had made it suitable for cultivation. When the farmer's plow horse suddenly sank into the ground, he initially assumed he had encountered a natural depression or perhaps an old well. It was only when he began digging to free his horse that he realized he had stumbled upon something far more sinister. The wooden chest containing the bones was remarkably well preserved, suggesting it had been buried relatively recently despite containing decade-old remains. The chest itself appeared to have been specifically constructed for the purpose of concealing a body with dimensions that precisely accommodated a human form. This level of preparation indicated that the burial was not a hasty attempt to conceal a crime, but rather part of a systematic approach to body disposal that had been refined over years of practice. The discovery of the first body in early 1829 set in motion a chain of events that would finally bring Patty Cannon's criminal empire to an end. Delaware authorities, working with their counterparts in Maryland, obtained search warrants and began a comprehensive investigation of all properties connected to the Cannon-Johnson gang. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. The investigation was led by Sheriff Joseph Houston of Sussex County, Delaware, working in coordination with Maryland authorities and representatives from the Pennsylvania governor's office. This multi-jurisdictional approach was unprecedented for the time period and reflected the growing recognition that the Cannon Gang's activities crossed state boundaries and required coordinated law enforcement response. The search warrants obtained by authorities were remarkably broad, allowing them to excavate any areas of the Cannon properties where bodies might be concealed. This legal authority was crucial, as it provided protection for investigators who might otherwise have been accused of trespassing or illegal search and seizure. The warrants also specified that any evidence discovered could be used in prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions, helping to close the legal loopholes that the gang had exploited for years. On April 3, 1829, Cyrus James was captured in Delaware. The circumstances of his arrest remain somewhat unclear, but court records suggest he was attempting to flee the region when he was apprehended. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of execution, the young man who had been forced into a life of crime as a child made a fateful decision. He would cooperate with authorities and reveal everything he knew about Patty Cannon's operations. The decision to cooperate was not made lightly by James. He understood that his testimony would likely result in his own prosecution for the crimes he had been forced to commit. But he also recognized that continued silence would mean protecting the woman who had enslaved him and forced him to participate in the destruction of countless other lives. His cooperation represented not just a legal strategy, but a moral choice to finally break free from the psychological control that Cannon had maintained over him for years. James's testimony was devastating. Speaking to Justice of the Peace in Seaford, Delaware, he provided detailed accounts of murders spanning nearly a decade. He told investigators that Joseph Johnson, his brother Ebenezer Johnson, and Patty Cannon had shot the Georgia slave trader while he was eating supper at Cannon's house. He had watched them carry the body to a wooden chest and bury it on the property. But this was just the beginning of his revelations. The level of detail in James's testimony was extraordinary and provided investigators with their first comprehensive understanding of the gang's operations. He was able to describe not just individual crimes, but the systematic methods employed by the gang over many years. He knew the locations of burial sites, the identities of other gang members, the routes used to transport kidnapped people, and the networks of buyers and sellers that stretched across multiple states. Following James's directions, authorities began excavating the Cannon property systematically. In a garden area, they found the body of a young mixed-race child. According to James's testimony, this child had been enslaved by Cannon, along with his mother. Cannon had killed the child because she suspected the father was white, possibly a member of her own family. The article preserving this testimony contains no information about the fate of the child's mother, leaving open the horrifying possibility that she too was murdered. The discovery of the child's body was particularly disturbing to investigators because it demonstrated the extent of Cannon's callousness. This was not a victim of kidnapping or a rival criminal. This was a child who had been born into Cannon's household and lived under her control. The murder appeared to have been motivated purely by Cannon's racist paranoia and her fear that a mixed-race child might somehow threaten her operations. Additional excavations revealed 2 wooden boxes, each containing human bones. James identified one set of remains as belonging to another child he had seen Cannon beat to death with a piece of wood. The third set belonged to an adult whom James described as someone they considered had property, meaning the gang believed this person was free and might have resources worth stealing. The systematic nature of these murders painted a picture of Cannon as something beyond a simple criminal. She was a serial killer who had been operating with impunity for years. Protected by the isolation of her location, the indifference of local authorities to crimes against African Americans, and a network of co-conspirators who shared in her profits. The physical evidence discovered during the excavations corroborated James's testimony in remarkable detail. The wooden boxes used to contain bodies were of similar construction, suggesting they had been specifically manufactured for the purpose of concealing murder victims. The locations of the graves followed a pattern that indicated systematic planning rather than random burial. Most disturbing, the condition of the remains suggested that some victims had been buried while still alive. As news of the discoveries spread, other witnesses began coming forward. People who had lived in fear of Cannon for years suddenly found the courage to speak. Their testimonies revealed additional victims and provided details about the gang's methods that corroborated James's account. Among these new witnesses was Thomas Freeman, a free African-American who had been approached by gang members in 1827 but had managed to escape. Freeman testified that he had been offered work in Georgia and had been traveling toward the Cannon property when he became suspicious of his escort's behavior. He managed to slip away during a rest stop and spent several days hiding in the woods before making his way back to Philadelphia. Freeman's testimony was significant because it provided insight into the gang's recruitment methods. He described how the initial approach had seemed completely legitimate. He had been struggling to find work in Philadelphia when a well-dressed man approached him with an offer of employment on a Georgia plantation. The wages offered were generous, and transportation was to be provided free of charge. It was only during the journey that Freeman began to notice inconsistencies in his escort's stories and became suspicious of their true intentions. The scope of the investigation expanded beyond Delaware. Authorities in Maryland began examining properties owned by gang members, while officials in Pennsylvania coordinated efforts to document the full extent of the kidnapping network. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Sussex County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the final chapter of Patty Cannon's reign of terror. The coordination between different jurisdictions represented a new approach to law enforcement that would later become standard practice. For the first time, authorities were treating the Cannon gang as what it truly was, an interstate criminal conspiracy that required federal-level response. This recognition led to the involvement of officials from Washington, D.C., and marked the beginning of what would eventually become coordinated federal law enforcement efforts against organized crime. On April 13, 1829, a grand jury of 24 white men in Delaware handed down indictments against Martha Patty Cannon on 4 counts of murder. The charges were signed by James Rogers, the Attorney General of Delaware, and represented the first time any member of the notorious gang had faced serious legal consequences for their crimes against African Americans. The composition of the grand jury itself was significant for the period. All 24 members were white males, as required by Delaware law, but they represented a cross-section of the state's population, including farmers, merchants, and professionals. The fact that this jury was willing to indict a white woman for the murder of African Americans marked a notable shift in legal attitudes, driven largely by the overwhelming evidence presented and the interstate nature of the crimes. The indictments were remarkably specific for the era. Cannon was charged with the murder of an infant female on April 26, 1822, a male child on the same date, an adult male on October 1, 1820, and a Negro boy on June 1, 1824. Each charge carried the death penalty, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. The specificity of these charges reflected the thorough investigation conducted by authorities. Unlike many criminal cases of the period, which relied primarily on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, the Cannon case was built on physical evidence, multiple corroborating witnesses, and detailed confessions from a participant who had intimate knowledge of the crimes. This combination of evidence types made the case virtually impossible to defend against. Cyrus James's testimony formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. His detailed knowledge of the gang's operations, combined with his ability to lead authorities to burial sites, made him the most valuable witness in Delaware legal history up to that point. The young man who had been forced into crime as a child now held the power to bring justice to the woman who had terrorized the region for decades. The prosecution team was led by Attorney General James Rogers, who had made his reputation prosecuting complex criminal cases across Delaware. Rogers understood that the Cannon case represented an opportunity to demonstrate that the law applied equally to all citizens, regardless of their race or social status. He also recognized that a successful prosecution would send a strong message to other criminal enterprises operating in the region. But Patty Cannon herself presented a figure that defied easy categorization, even for her contemporaries. Newspaper accounts described her as a large, physically powerful woman who commanded fear and respect, even from hardened criminals. At approximately 70 years old, she remained sharp-minded and defiant, showing no remorse for her actions, even when confronted with irrefutable evidence. Contemporary descriptions of Cannon during her imprisonment paint a picture of an unrepentant criminal who seemed genuinely puzzled by the legal proceedings against her. She apparently viewed her actions as legitimate business activities and expressed bewilderment that authorities were prosecuting her for crimes against people she considered to be property rather than human beings. The conditions of her imprisonment in the Sussex County Jail in Georgetown, Delaware, reflected both the seriousness of her crimes and the unusual nature of having a female defendant facing multiple murder charges. She was kept under constant guard, as authorities feared both escape attempts and potential retaliation from surviving gang members. The Georgetown Jail itself was a crude stone structure that had been built in the early 1800s to house petty criminals and debtors. It was not designed to hold dangerous felons facing capital charges, and authorities had to implement special security measures to ensure Cannon's continued detention. Extra guards were posted, and her cell was reinforced with additional iron bars and locks. During her confinement, Cannon began to speak more freely about her criminal career. According to contemporary accounts, she admitted to killing at least 24 people over the course of her criminal career. These victims included not just the African Americans found buried on her property, but also rival slave traders, potential witnesses, and anyone else who posed a threat to her operations. The most chilling aspect of Cannon's confessions was their matter-of-fact tone. She spoke of murder as a business necessity, describing the killing of children and adults with the same casual indifference she might have used to discuss livestock. Her apparent lack of any moral conscience shocked even hardened law enforcement officials who had seen the worst of frontier violence. Cannon's confessions provided authorities with details about crimes that extended far beyond the charges for which she had been indicted. She described murders dating back to the early 1810s, kidnappings that had involved hundreds of victims, and a criminal network that had reached into multiple states. These revelations confirmed investigators' suspicions that the crimes discovered on her property represented only a fraction of the gang's total activities. The legal proceedings moved forward with unusual speed for the period. The overwhelming evidence, combined with public pressure for justice, created momentum for a quick trial and resolution. Court records suggest that Cannon was expected to face trial within weeks of her indictment, with execution to follow shortly thereafter if she were convicted. The prosecution's strategy was straightforward: present the physical evidence, provide testimony from Cyrus James and other witnesses, and allow the jury to reach the obvious conclusion that Cannon was guilty of multiple murders. The defense, such as it was, could only argue for mercy based on Cannon's age and gender, though few observers believed such arguments would be effective given the horrific nature of the crimes. The trial was scheduled to begin in late May 1829, with jury selection planned for the week before. Legal observers from across the region were expected to attend, as the case represented one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in Delaware history. Newspapers as far away as Philadelphia and Baltimore were planning extensive coverage of the proceedings. The legal proceedings against Patty Cannon would never reach their intended conclusion. On May 11, 1829, approximately 3 weeks before her scheduled execution, jail guards found her dead in her cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by poison, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. Some accounts suggest she had been smuggled arsenic by sympathizers, while others propose she had been hoarding medication for weeks. The discovery of Cannon's body sent shockwaves through the Georgetown jail and the broader community. Guards making their regular morning rounds found her lying on the floor of her cell, apparently having died sometime during the night. There were no signs of struggle or violence, and the cell remained securely locked from the outside. The only evidence of what had occurred was a small vial found hidden in her clothing, which later analysis suggested had contained arsenic. The question of how Cannon obtained the poison remained a mystery that investigators never fully resolved. The jail's security procedures were relatively lax by modern standards, and visitors were not thoroughly searched before meeting with prisoners. It was possible that a sympathizer had smuggled the poison to her during one of these visits, though no specific individual was ever identified as the source. Some contemporaries speculated that Cannon had been planning her suicide from the moment of her arrest. She had witnessed the execution of her daughter's first husband and understood exactly what fate awaited her if she were convicted. Rather than face the public humiliation of execution, she chose to die on her own terms, maintaining control over her fate until the very end. Her death robbed the victims' families of the satisfaction of seeing justice served, but it also brought to a close one of the most systematic criminal enterprises in early American history. Court records show that Cannon's death effectively ended the reverse Underground Railroad that had operated along the Delmarva Peninsula for nearly 2 decades. The immediate aftermath of Cannon's death was chaotic. Authorities had been preparing for what they expected to be the most significant criminal trial in Delaware history, and her suicide left them with unresolved questions about the full extent of her criminal network. The investigation into her activities continued for several months, but without her testimony, many details about the gang's operations remained unclear. The fate of her surviving co-conspirators varied. Joseph Johnson, her son-in-law and primary partner, had fled to Alabama or Mississippi before the investigations began. His brother Ebenezer also escaped to the Deep South, where they presumably continued their criminal activities beyond the reach of Delaware authorities. Local law enforcement made half-hearted attempts to pursue them, but the jurisdictional complications and vast distances involved made successful prosecution unlikely. Only Cyrus James, the enslaved boy forced into crime, remained to face justice, and his cooperation with authorities ultimately led to his freedom rather than execution. The Delaware courts, recognizing that James had been coerced into participating in the gang's activities and that his testimony had been crucial to uncovering the crimes, granted him his freedom and provided him with protection from retaliation. James's fate after the trial represented one of the few positive outcomes from the entire tragic episode. He was relocated to Pennsylvania, where abolitionists helped him establish a new identity and begin a legitimate life. Some accounts suggest he later became active in the Underground Railroad, using his knowledge of criminal networks to help legitimate efforts to assist escaped slaves. The investigation revealed that the Cannon-Johnson gang had been responsible for the kidnapping of hundreds of free African Americans over the course of their operations. While exact numbers remain disputed, conservative estimates suggest they trafficked between 500 and 1,000 people into slavery in the Deep South. The economic value of these crimes, measured in the prices slaves commanded in southern markets, represented millions of dollars in today's currency. The human cost of these crimes extended far beyond simple statistics. Each kidnapping represented the destruction of a family, the theft of a life, and the perpetuation of a system that treated human beings as property. Many victims were never recovered, living out their lives in bondage hundreds of miles from their homes. Children were separated from parents, spouses from each other, and entire communities lived in fear of similar attacks. The geographic scope of the gang's activities was equally staggering. Evidence collected during the investigation showed connections to criminal networks operating from New York to Louisiana. The Cannon Gang had been part of a larger system of illegal human trafficking that exploited the jurisdictional confusion and limited law enforcement capabilities of the early 19th century. Patty Cannon's body was initially buried in the graveyard of the Georgetown jail where she died. The burial was conducted without ceremony, reflecting the community's desire to forget the horrors associated with her name. When that land was later developed into a parking lot in the 20th century, her remains were moved to a potter's field near the new prison. In a bizarre twist that reflects the sensationalist attitude toward her crimes, her skull was separated from the rest of her remains and put on display in various venues over the years. As recently as 1961, it was on loan to the Dover Public Library, serving as a macabre reminder of one of Delaware's darkest chapters. This treatment of her remains, while disturbing by modern standards, reflected the public's continued fascination with her crimes and their desire to remember the horrors she had perpetrated. The legacy of Patty Cannon extends far beyond her individual crimes. Her story illustrates the systematic violence that underpinned American slavery, the vulnerability of free African Americans in the antebellum period, and the ways that geographic and legal loopholes could be exploited by sophisticated criminals. The reverse Underground Railroad she operated represented the dark mirror image of the networks that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. A reminder that for every story of liberation, there were countless others of re-enslavement and death. Modern historians continue to study the Cannon case as an example of how criminal enterprises could flourish in the gaps between legal jurisdictions. Her ability to operate for nearly 2 decades despite the knowledge of local communities demonstrates the combination of racism, legal limitations, and economic incentives that allowed such horrors to continue. The case also highlighted the limitations of early 19th century law enforcement. The lack of coordination between different jurisdictions, the absence of professional police forces, and the limited communication capabilities of the period all contributed to the gang's ability to operate with impunity. These lessons would later inform efforts to develop more effective law enforcement strategies for dealing with interstate crime. The impact on the local community was profound and lasting. The area around Johnson's Crossroads never fully recovered from its association with the Cannon Gang. The name was eventually changed to Reliance in an effort to escape the infamy, but the stigma persisted for generations. Property values in the area remained depressed for decades, and many families chose to relocate rather than remain in a place associated with such horrors. The Cannon case also had broader implications for American society's understanding of race and crime. The willingness of authorities to finally prosecute these crimes, even though the victims were primarily African Americans, marked a small but significant shift in legal attitudes. While this change was limited and temporary, it represented recognition that all people, regardless of race, deserved legal protection. The documentation and investigation of Cannon's crimes also contributed to the growing abolitionist movement. The systematic nature of the kidnapping network and the ease with which free African Americans could be reduced to slavery provided powerful evidence for abolitionists arguing that the entire system of slavery was inherently corrupt and dangerous. In the decades following Cannon's death, her story became part of regional folklore, though the details were often distorted or sensationalized. Numerous books, pamphlets, and newspaper articles recounted her crimes, though many mixed fact with fiction in ways that made it difficult to separate historical truth from legend. The most famous of these was George Alfred Townsend's novel, The Entailed Hat, published in 1884, which used Cannon's story as the basis for a melodramatic tale of frontier crime. The site of the original Cannon house remained a source of morbid fascination for decades. Visitors would travel to the remote location to see where the crimes had occurred, and local residents developed a cottage industry providing tours and selling souvenirs. The original house was finally torn down in 1948, but the site continued to attract curiosity seekers well into the modern era. This mystery shows us how easily society can turn a blind eye to systematic violence when the victims are perceived as less than fully human. The indifference that allowed Patty Cannon to operate for decades was finally overcome only when her crimes expanded to include white victims whose disappearances could not be ignored. The legal system that failed to protect free African Americans from kidnapping and murder was the same system that ultimately prosecuted Cannon only when she threatened the interests of white slave traders. The Cannon case serves as a stark reminder of the human capacity for evil and the importance of vigilant law enforcement and community responsibility. It demonstrates how criminal enterprises can flourish in environments where society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. Most importantly, it preserves the memory of hundreds of victims whose names are largely forgotten, but whose suffering should never be minimized or ignored. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the full scope of her criminal network? The evidence suggests that Patty Cannon's gang was part of a much larger system of illegal human trafficking that extended far beyond the Delaware-Maryland border. Many questions remain unanswered about the full extent of their activities and the fate of their victims. Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories from America's hidden past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries from our nation's forgotten crimes. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another terrifying true story from the shadows of American history.